too. There's an impact site here from the second. But none of these were what we would consider penetrating gunshot wounds. This acts like a bulletproof vest. Maybe the legend is true.
Perhaps the bones found in the forest aren't from people killed in the basement that night after all. A gunshot aimed at the heart, deflected by jewels sewn beneath the clothes. The accounts that bullets ricocheted, that Maria or Anastasia and Alexei perhaps survived the initial gunfire, are becoming plausible. For almost a century, these accounts have been the basis for many spurious claims to the Russian throne. Anna Anderson's claim was the most famous. She went to her grave claiming to be the last Grand Duchess Anastasia. She convinced many people, including the family of Peter Sarandanaki, whose ancestors were part of the Tsar's inner circle.
My mother-in-law, to her dying days, to her last day, believed that Anna Anderson was Anastasia. For instance, she had a triangular injury on her foot, which was probably a bayonet stab. She also had the same stub toe problem as Anastasia. She had the same ear as Anastasia. There were a lot of similarities between the two.
Despite her persuasive story, DNA testing after her death revealed her true identity. She was not a royal, but a former factory worker from Poland. But determining whether the latest remains are those of the Romanov family or simply another case of mistaken identity will take time. The DNA is so degraded that it must be copied or amplified to recover and identify any surviving fragments of genetic information that remain. At his lab outside Washington, D.C., DNA expert Michael Coble and his team are using a process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. By exposing the faint traces of DNA that remain to a bacterial enzyme, a single piece of DNA can be multiplied, generating millions of copies. But even after amplification, there are no guarantees that any readable DNA will emerge to make identification possible. For now, the identity of the two individuals in the grave remains a mystery. While the search for viable DNA continues in America, in Russia, the search for clues has come to an end. Forensic expert Anthony Falsetti is going back with more questions than answers about the most recent grave. In the 1991 excavation, nearly intact full skeletons were found. But in the grave uncovered in 2007, only fragments were unearthed. Why were there so few bones? Less than 10% of a full skeleton was found. But even these scant remains can reveal more than DNA. The degraded condition of the most recently discovered bones might actually be a clue in itself. Anthony Falsetti is about to take another look at the information he's collected at his laboratory at the University of Florida. Drawing on his long experience of bringing stories of the dead back to life, he's looking for any patterns or links with other evidence. He'll comb through the accounts of the executioners and see if the history and bones tell a common story. He already knows that this will be a harrowing tale. The savagery did not end when the shooting stopped. Firing squad leader Yakov Yurovsky wrote that after the killing was done, he feared that loyalist troops might catch them red-handed. The plan was for a quick and clean disposal, but as the bodies were being loaded into a truck, the plan unraveled.
As they were lifting up one of the bodies, she sat up and screamed. It was either Marie or Anastasia. We know that 2 of the Grand Duchesses left that room alive. Ermakov grabbed a nearby rifle and ended up smashing them repeatedly in the face until they stopped screaming.
The bodies were then transported a dozen miles outside Yekaterinburg to the Koptyaki forest, to an area of abandoned mine works.
So here's what we know. The bodies were taken into the forest. They were thrown down a mine shaft. Grenades were thrown after them in an attempt to collapse the walls.
The bodies were only partially hidden. As dawn approached, Yurovsky returned to Yekaterinburg to report to his superiors. Misfortune struck again. Yurovsky's men got drunk and bragged to locals, telling them how they'd killed the royals and the location of the bodies. Their commander insisted on keeping the burial secret. The corpses had to be moved.
The next day, the bodies were retrieved, and Yurovsky has his men looking for a new location.
But after the bodies were exhumed, summer rain turned the ground to a gluey mud. The truck got stuck. The corpses had to be offloaded. Commander Yurovsky was exhausted, and his men became mutinous. He decided to try burning 2 of the bodies. To make the process easier, his men were ordered to dismember the corpses. Physical damage to fragment number 147 supports the dismemberment story. The royal remains were allegedly subject to another indignity, but the evidence wouldn't be visible. Yurovsky claimed that his men poured acid over the corpses to disfigure them beyond recognition. Chemical composition tests on the bones conducted in Russia revealed faint traces of sulfuric acid. According to Yurovsky, it was then that his men burned what was left of the 2 bodies. It's another element of the story that can be put to a forensic test. As an alternative to human flesh, pork is a good substitute. The composition and structure of the meat is similar to its human equivalent, and pigs are often used in forensic comparisons.
We know that they had between an hour and a half and 3 hours to completely consume 2 human bodies.
3 hours later, the pig carcass is charred, but still intact.
What we've demonstrated here is it's not possible to consume a body in a fire. Certainly not one for 3 hours, relatively low temperatures.
Yurovsky's plan to incinerate the corpses was more than a failure. It was a fiasco. Dawn was breaking, and there were still 9 bodies in the truck. A drastic change in tactics was in order. He claimed his men dug a second pit further to the west, that they threw the remaining 9 bodies into the pit, poured acid on them, and then covered them with planks and soil.
What we know about history is being reflected by the evidence.
But circumstantial evidence will not be enough to put